The doors of the high chamber closed behind me with a sound like a final breath, and I knew before anyone spoke that my people had already lost. My name is Daniel Cole, and on that day I was 26 years old, standing in a circle of light while 9 alien judges looked down at me from their high seats. I was not a criminal. I was not a soldier on trial for a single act. I was there as a representative of every human being alive, and the weight of that made my knees feel like water. The chamber smelled of cold metal, and something sharp, like burnt sugar, which I later learned was simply how the air tasted on their ships. Around me stood delegates from 6 different worlds, none of them human, all of them watching me the way you might watch a fire that had gotten too close to your house. "Daniel Cole of Earth," said the lead judge, a tall being with skin like polished stone and eyes that never blinked. "You have heard the evidence. Do you deny it?" I did not deny it. How could I? 3 months earlier, a human survey ship called the Halden had entered a region of space that had never been mapped by our people, a quiet corner of the galaxy that belonged, according to old treaties none of us had ever seen, to a species called the Veyron. The Halden's captain, a good man named Peter Lang, had no idea he was crossing any line. His scanners found nothing. His charts showed empty space. But the Veyron considered that region sacred, untouchable, and when their patrol ships intercepted the Halden, something went wrong in the first seconds of contact. Nobody among us knows exactly what triggered it, not even now, 200 years later. Some say it was a misread signal. Some say the Veyron fired first out of fear. Whatever the truth, 3 Veyron ships were destroyed, and 11 of their people did not come home. Humanity had been part of the wider galaxy for only 9 years at that point. 9 years of trade, of cautious meetings, of us trying to prove that we were worth knowing. And in one single afternoon, all of that was undone. "We do not deny the incident happened," I said, keeping my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking at my sides. "We ask only that you judge us by our full record, not by one tragedy born of confusion." The judge with the stone skin tilted his head, and for a moment I thought I saw something like pity in his expression. It did not last. "Your full record, Daniel Cole, is the problem," he said. "In 9 years, your species has shown more capacity for violence, more speed of expansion, and more unpredictability than any species we have observed in 10,000 years of recorded history. You did not simply make a mistake. You confirmed what many of us already feared." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell them about the millions of humans who had never held a weapon, who spent their lives growing food or raising children or writing songs. I wanted to tell them that judging 11 billion people by one bad afternoon was not justice. It was fear wearing the mask of law. But I had been warned before I entered that chamber. Anger would only prove their point. So instead I said quietly, "What is it you intend to do with us?" There was a long silence. Then the judge spoke words that would change the fate of my species forever. "Effective immediately, Earth and all human colonies are placed under the Veil Protocol. A dampening field will be constructed around your solar system, extending to the edge of your Oort cloud. No ship will pass through it in either direction. No signal beyond simple light and radio will cross it. You will keep whatever technology exists within your system today, but you will receive no further contact, no further trade, and no further teaching from the wider galaxy. This is not a punishment with an end date, Daniel Cole. This is a quarantine. You will remain behind the veil until the Concord determines, if ever, that your species has become safe to release." I remember the sound that left my mouth was not quite a word. It was closer to the sound a person makes when the ground disappears beneath them. "For how long?" I finally managed. "Give us a number. A generation, too. Something we can hold on to." The judge looked almost sorry when he answered. "There is no number, there is only proof. And proof, Daniel Cole, is something your species has never been very good at giving us." I was escorted out of that chamber by 2 guards who did not touch me, but walked close enough that I understood the message. Outside, on the landing platform, I looked up and saw the sky of that alien world, purple and strange, filled with ships from 6 different species going about their business as if nothing had happened, as if humanity was already a footnote, instead of a living thing about to be sealed away. The ship that carried the delegation home was silent the entire journey. Nobody spoke, nobody cried, not yet. We were all doing the math in our heads, trying to imagine what a solar system with no way out would actually feel like once the doors closed. We arrived at Earth 11 days later. I remember standing on the observation deck with an engineer named Grace Ellison, watching through the wide viewport as the Veil Protocol began. It did not look violent. It did not look like an explosion, or a wall slamming shut. It looked, at first, like a shimmer, a thin ripple of light spreading outward from a dozen alien construction platforms stationed just beyond Neptune. Grace gripped the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and I understood exactly what she meant, because it was beautiful, and that made it so much worse. Something so gentle-looking was about to cut 11 billion people off from everyone else who had ever existed. "How long do you think it will hold?" she asked me. I did not have an honest answer, so I gave her the only one I had. Long enough that we had better learn to live without them. Over the following weeks, humanity watched the shimmer thicken into something solid, something you could see even during the day if you knew where to look, a faint silver line at the edge of the sky like a scar across the heavens. The last alien ships that had been present in our system for trade and diplomacy departed one by one. I stood on a rooftop in a coastal city and watched the final ship lift off, a sleek Veyron vessel that had once brought us medicine and star charts and the promise of friendship. It rose without hesitation, turned toward the edge of the system, and did not look back. There was no ceremony, no goodbye speech. They simply left, the way you might leave a room you no longer wanted to be in. That night, for the first time in 9 years, Earth's communication arrays picked up nothing from beyond the edge of the solar system. Not a single signal, not a single ship transponder. Just silence, deep and total, stretching out in every direction like an ocean with no far shore. I remember sitting with my father that evening, an old teacher named Edward Cole, who had spent his whole life believing that humanity's greatest days were the ones still ahead of us, out there among the stars. He did not say much. He simply poured 2 cups of tea, handed me one, and looked out the window at the sky. "They think this is the end of us," he finally said. "Isn't it?" I asked, and I meant it. I was young enough, and frightened enough, to believe that a species cut off from everyone else might simply fade, might grow smaller and quieter until it disappeared. My father shook his head slowly, and there was something in his eyes that I would not fully understand until many years later, when I had become an old man myself, watching a very different kind of ship rise into the sky. "No," he said. "This is the end of who we were pretending to be for them. Now we get to find out who we actually are, when nobody is watching, and nobody is judging, and there is nowhere left to run except forward." I did not sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the wind outside, thinking about the silence beyond the veil, thinking about the 11 billion of us now sealed inside a single small system while a galaxy of trillions moved on without us. I thought we had lost everything. I did not yet understand that we had only lost the parts of ourselves that had never mattered in the first place, and that everything we would need to survive, to grow, and eventually to return, was already inside us, waiting for a reason to wake up. The veil finished closing 3 days later. From that morning onward, for 200 years, no human being would see another star up close, would shake the hand of another species, or would hear a voice from beyond our own small corner of the universe. We were alone. And though none of us could see it yet, standing there in the first cold days of our exile, that loneliness was about to become the forge that shaped us into something the galaxy had never expected, and would one day come to fear far more than it ever feared the crew of a single lost survey ship. The first 10 years behind the veil were the hardest, and I do not say that lightly, because I lived through all 200 of them, kept alive by medicine and technology that I will explain in time. Food shortages hit within the first winter. The alien trade routes that had once brought rare minerals and manufactured parts from other worlds vanished overnight, and our factories, built to depend on those imports, ground to a halt one by one. I watched cities that had been growing brighter every year slide back into darkness because there was no longer enough power to keep every light burning. Grace Ellison, the engineer who had stood beside me on that observation deck, became one of the most important people on the planet during those years, though almost nobody knew her name outside of her own laboratory. She led a team that took apart every piece of alien technology humanity had managed to acquire during our 9 years of contact, not to copy it exactly, but to understand the principles behind it, and rebuild those principles using materials we actually had. It was slow, painful work, full of failures that cost lives when early reactors overheated or early ships lost power mid-flight. But it was also the beginning of something the conquered had never predicted, because they had always taught new species slowly, carefully, holding back knowledge until they judged a species ready for it. We did not have that luxury. We did not have a patient teacher standing over our shoulder telling us to wait. We had hunger, and darkness, and a very simple choice between learning fast or not learning at all. I remember visiting Grace's laboratory during my work as a young officer helping to coordinate resources between cities. She was thinner than she used to be, her hair streaked with early gray, though she was barely past 30, and there were burn marks on her hands that she never bothered to hide. "We finally understand the drive core," she told me that day, and there was a light in her eyes I had not seen since before the veil closed. Not exactly how they built it, better. Ours is heavier, but it does not fail the way theirs did. Better how? I asked. She smiled, tired but proud. Their systems were built to be safe first and powerful second, because they had 1,000 years to be patient. We do not have 1,000 years, Daniel, so we built ours to be powerful first, and we are learning to make it safe as we go. That single sentence, more than anything else, captures what happened to humanity during those first decades. We were not copying a graceful, patient civilization. We were a desperate people racing against our own hunger and fear, and that desperation became a strange kind of gift, because it stripped away every slow habit, every unnecessary caution, every rule that existed simply because it always had. By the 20th year of the Veil, the worst of the shortages had passed. New reactors, built from Grace's reworked designs, lit up cities that had gone dark. Farms recovered using techniques adapted from alien agricultural science mixed with old human methods that had never been fully replaced. For the first time since the chamber doors closed on me, I allowed myself to believe that humanity might actually survive this. Survival, though, was never going to be enough for us, and I think that is the part the Concord never understood about our species. A frightened, isolated people does not simply settle into quiet acceptance. It looks for meaning, for purpose, for something to build toward, and humanity found that purpose in a project that began almost by accident. It started with an old military engineer named Owen Blake, a stubborn man with a temper who had lost his brother in a shortage-related accident during the first winter, and never quite forgave the galaxy for abandoning us to that fate. Owen believed, long before most people were ready to hear it, that the Veil would not last forever, and that when it finally weakened or broke, humanity needed to be ready for whatever came through, whether that was rescue or another kind of judgment. He was mocked at first. People called him paranoid, obsessed, a man chasing ghosts instead of helping rebuild farms and hospitals like everyone else. But Owen kept working, quietly gathering a small group of engineers and scientists who agreed that hope alone was not a plan. Among them was a brilliant young woman named Nora Fenwick, barely out of university, who had a gift for material science that even Grace Ellison admitted she had never seen matched. Nora's early work focused on hull plating, an unglamorous subject that most people ignored, but she approached it with a kind of obsession that reminded me of my own father's stubborn belief that we had a future worth preparing for. She spent years testing alloys, failing, testing again, sleeping in her laboratory more nights than she slept in her own bed. By the time she was 30, her plating designs were stronger than anything the Concord had ever shown us during our brief years of contact, not because she had access to better materials, but because she had access to something they did not, an entire species working without limits, without a patient teacher telling her to slow down and follow the accepted method. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters. Those years were not only about brilliant engineers making breakthroughs in quiet laboratories, they were also about ordinary people, farmers and teachers and parents, holding communities together through fear and loss. A woman named Claire Dunmore ran a small school in a mountain town that had lost half its power grid during the second winter, and she kept that school open every single day, teaching children by candlelight when the generators failed, because she believed, fiercely, that a generation raised without hope for the future was a generation that would never fight for one. I met her many years later, an old woman by then, and she told me something I never forgot. They thought cutting us off would make us small, she said. They should have known that when you corner a person, you either break them or you make them dangerous. They just did not understand which kind of species we were. By the 40th year, humanity had achieved something the Concord judges would never have believed possible. We were not simply surviving behind the veil. We were thriving, in a strange, hardened way, building a civilization shaped entirely by our own choices rather than the cautious guidance of older species. Our cities grew efficient rather than beautiful, our governments grew simpler and more unified out of pure necessity, and our military, born originally from fear of what might one day come through the veil, grew into something disciplined and quietly formidable, even though it had almost nothing to test itself against beyond old training simulations and the occasional dangerous experiment gone wrong. It was during the 60th year that something happened which changed the direction of everything, and it began, of all places, with a mistake in Grace Ellison's laboratory, now run by her former student, a careful and methodical man named Simon Vale. Simon had been experimenting with a modified version of the alien drive core, trying to push its output beyond what the original design allowed, hoping to shorten travel times between Earth and the human colonies still struggling to survive on Mars and in the asteroid belt. During one late test, a small prototype ship, unmanned and meant only for data collection, briefly touched the inner edge of the veil itself while attempting a course correction. Nothing dramatic happened. The ship did not explode. It did not disappear. But for exactly 4 seconds, the sensors aboard that small prototype recorded a fluctuation in the veil's energy signature. A tiny flicker in a field that had remained perfectly stable for 60 years. Simon brought the data to Owen Blake personally, both men staying awake through the night poring over the readings. What they found gave them the first real hope humanity had felt since the day the veil closed. The dampening field, powerful as it was, had never been designed to withstand direct, sustained pressure from the inside. It had been built to keep a primitive, struggling species contained without effort, the way a fence is built to hold back sheep, not soldiers. Nobody on the other side had ever imagined that in 60 short years, the species trapped inside would develop technology capable of straining that fence at all. "It is not a door," Owen said that night, his voice shaking with an emotion I never saw in him before or after. "Not yet. But it is a seam, and seams can be widened." Word of the discovery spread carefully at first, shared only among trusted scientists and military leaders, because the last thing anyone wanted was false hope spreading through a population still recovering from decades of hardship. I was brought into that circle not long after, given my role coordinating between the scattered human colonies, and I remember the meeting where Owen laid out his plan with a level of calm certainty that surprised everyone in the room. "We are not going to break the veil by force," he said. "Not for a long time, maybe not for 100 years, but we are going to understand it, piece by piece, the same way we understood the drive core, the same way Nora understood hull plating. And when the day comes that we are ready, truly ready, that seam is going to become our door." I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment I heard the news. "And what happens when we walk through it? What happens when the Concorde realizes we did not wait for their permission?" Owen looked at me for a long moment, and I remember the small, tired smile that crossed his face. The same smile I would see again decades later on a very different kind of day, standing on the deck of a ship none of us could have imagined back then. "Then they are going to have to decide," he said, "whether they want to negotiate with the species they threw away, or whether they want to find out exactly what 200 years of being underestimated is capable of building." None of us knew that night that his number would turn out to be almost exactly right. None of us could have guessed how long the road ahead truly was. How many more discoveries, losses, and quiet sacrifices it would take to turn that small 4-second flicker into something powerful enough to change the fate of every human being alive. But for the first time in 60 years, standing in that dim, crowded room full of tired, determined faces, I felt something I had almost forgotten how to feel. I felt hope, not the soft, fragile kind that waits for someone else to come and save you, but the hard, patient kind that gets up every single morning and keeps building anyway, because it has decided, quietly and completely, that the future belongs to those willing to earn it themselves. By the time I turned 100 years old, a number that would have sounded impossible to my father's generation, I had stopped counting the years as a burden and started counting them as evidence. Medicine developed during the Veil years, built on principles borrowed and reworked from the small amount of alien biological knowledge we had gathered during our brief contact, had extended human life far beyond anything our ancestors imagined. I was not unusual for my time. I was simply one of billions who had lived long enough to watch a civilization rebuild itself from nothing into something the rest of the galaxy would soon find impossible to ignore. The century mark felt like a turning point, not because of any single event, but because it was the moment when I looked around at the world I had grown old inside of and realized it no longer resembled the frightened, hungry planet I remembered from my youth. Earth's cities had changed entirely. Gone were the old divisions between nations that had defined so much of human history before the Veil. There had been no grand agreement, no single treaty that unified the planet. It had happened slowly, almost quietly, driven by the simple fact that a species facing extinction from isolation did not have the luxury of wasting energy on old rivalries. Resources were shared because they had to be. Knowledge was shared because keeping secrets from each other while the entire species faced an uncertain future felt, eventually, like a foolish kind of pride nobody could afford anymore. By the time I reached my 100th year, Earth operated under a single coordinated government, not because anyone had been forced into it, but because the alternative had simply stopped making sense generations earlier. Our culture had changed as well, in ways that surprised even those of us who had lived through every step of it. Without the wider galaxy watching, judging, offering slow lessons and cautious trade, humanity turned its attention entirely inward and upward at the same time. Inward toward relentless self-improvement, and upward toward the stars we could still see but not yet reach. Schools no longer simply taught children how to read and calculate. They taught engineering alongside history, taught the story of the tribunal and the veil alongside basic mathematics, so that every child grew up understanding exactly what had been taken from their species and exactly what would be required to take it back. I remember visiting a school not far from where Claire Dunmore had once taught by candlelight, now a gleaming building full of children working on real engineering projects meant to feed directly into the colony expansion programs. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, proudly showed me a small working model of an improved reactor housing, something that would have been considered advanced research only a few decades earlier. When I asked him why he had chosen that particular project, he looked at me with a seriousness that startled me in someone so young. "Because someday we are going to need it," he said simply, "when we finally get to go out there again." That sentence, spoken so plainly by a child, captured something essential about what humanity had become. We were not simply surviving behind the veil anymore. We were preparing, every single one of us in ways large and small, for a return that most people believed with total certainty would eventually come. Our military doctrine, meanwhile, had grown into something unlike anything the wider galaxy had ever built, precisely because it had developed without any outside influence at all. In the years following Owen Blake's discovery of the seam in the veil, our leaders understood that whatever training and philosophy we developed would need to be built entirely from our own history, our own instincts, and our own hard-earned lessons, since there was no ally out there willing to teach us anything. I served during those middle decades as part of what eventually became known as the Unified Defense Corps, and I watched firsthand as our approach to conflict and strategy grew sharper, faster, and more adaptable with each passing generation. Where the little we had seen of alien military doctrine during our short years of contact had emphasized caution, hierarchy, and careful adherence to established protocol, our own doctrine grew from centuries of human history filled with sudden change, rapid invention, and constant adaptation to new and unexpected threats. We trained not to follow a single perfect plan, but to adjust instantly when a plan failed, because every human soldier, whether they had ever set foot in actual combat or not, had grown up hearing the stories of those first desperate years when survival itself depended on exactly that kind of flexibility. Nora Fenwick, the brilliant materials scientist from Owen's original circle, was in her 60s by then, still working, still restless, now leading an entire division dedicated to hull and armor design for what everyone quietly understood would eventually become an actual fleet of ships built for more than simple colony transport. I visited her workshop often during those years, partly for official reports, partly because I had come to consider her a friend, one of the few people left who remembered those early frightened days as clearly as I did. "You know what the strange part is?" she told me one afternoon, running her hand along a section of the newest armor plating, dark and faintly textured in a way that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Every single improvement we have made, every single breakthrough, exists because nobody ever told us it was impossible. The Concorde spent 1,000 years perfecting their design slowly, testing every small change for decades before trusting it. We do not have that patience, and honestly, Daniel, I do not think we ever will. We test, we fail, we lose people sometimes, and then we fix it and move forward. It is a harder way to build, but I think, in the end, it might be a better way." I did not fully understand how right she was until the year the first true scout ships were finally ready to test the seam Owen Blake had discovered decades earlier. By that point, Owen himself had passed away, an old man surrounded by the students and engineers who had carried his early obsession forward into something real. His granddaughter, a sharp and quietly fierce woman named Ruth Hale, had taken over leadership of the project that had once been considered nothing more than one stubborn man's paranoid hobby. Under Ruth's guidance, decades of careful research into the veil's energy patterns had finally produced something remarkable. A narrow, carefully calculated method of passing a small, specially shielded vessel through the field without triggering the massive automatic responses that everyone assumed the Concorde had built into the barrier as a final safeguard. I was present, along with Ruth and a small group of senior officers, in the control room the night the first scout ship attempted the crossing. The tension in that room was unlike anything I had felt since the day I stood in the tribunal chamber, over a century earlier, listening to our fate being decided by strangers. This time, though, the fear was mixed with something else entirely, a fierce and quiet determination that had been building inside our species for generations. The ship, small and unmanned, guided by systems more advanced than anything the galaxy had shown us during our brief years of contact, approached the calculated point in the veil with careful precision. For a moment, the readings on every screen in that room seemed to freeze, and I remember holding my breath along with everyone else, half expecting the field to react violently, to destroy the ship instantly the way we had always feared it might. Instead, the small vessel simply passed through, its systems flickering briefly before stabilizing, its sensors immediately beginning to transmit data from a stretch of space no human eyes had seen in over 140 years. The room erupted into a kind of quiet, disbelieving joy that I find difficult to describe even now. Ruth Hale, usually so composed and serious, sat down heavily in her chair and simply stared at the screen for a long moment before finally speaking. "We did it," she whispered. "Grandfather, we actually did it." What that scout ship found on the other side of the veil, however, changed the entire direction of humanity's plans, and not in the way any of us expected. We had always assumed, quietly, fearfully, that the galaxy beyond our prison had continued moving forward during our long isolation, growing stronger, more advanced, more powerful, exactly as it had been when the tribunal first sealed us away. What the scout ship's sensors revealed instead was something none of us had prepared for. Drifting not far beyond the veil's outer edge was an old Concord monitoring outpost, one of the stations that had presumably been placed there generations earlier to watch for exactly this kind of breach attempt. Its systems, according to the scout ship scans, were badly outdated, running on technology that appeared to be, in some ways, less advanced than what humanity had already developed on our own. Its defensive systems were minimal, clearly designed for a threat the Concord had stopped taking seriously long ago. Ruth ordered a wider sweep, and over the following weeks, as additional careful, cautious scout missions slipped through the seam and returned safely, a clearer picture began to form. The wider galaxy had not spent the last century and a half racing forward the way we had feared. If anything, much of Concord space appeared to have settled into a kind of comfortable, unchallenged stability. A civilization so secure in its position, so certain that no threat remained capable of testing it, that innovation itself had slowed to a crawl. I remember the meeting where this information was presented to the full Unified Defense Corps command, and the mixture of emotions in that room was almost impossible to untangle. There was relief, certainly, the realization that the galaxy we had feared for so long was not the unstoppable, endlessly advancing force we had imagined. But there was also something colder, something that took longer to fully settle into words. A young officer, barely 30, finally said what many of us were already thinking. "They stopped growing because they stopped needing to," she said. "They exiled the one species that scared them, and then they simply relaxed. They have been standing still while we have been running as fast as we possibly could for over 100 years. The debate that followed lasted for months, spreading beyond the military command into the highest levels of Earth's unified government. Some argued for caution, for continuing to build and study quietly for another generation or two, before making any kind of move, worried that revealing our progress too soon might provoke exactly the kind of fear that had gotten us exiled in the first place. Others, myself included, began to argue for something bolder, though not reckless, a controlled, deliberate step forward rather than decades more of hiding behind a seam only we knew existed. I remember standing before that same council, an old man by then though still strong and clear-headed thanks to the medicine our scientists had perfected, making the argument that would eventually shape everything that followed. "We were exiled for being unpredictable and fast," I told them. "We spent 140 years proving that judgment was not entirely wrong. We are unpredictable. We are fast. But we used that nature to survive, to build, to become something worth respecting instead of something worth fearing. If we hide forever, we prove nothing except that their fear worked." I do not believe that is the story we want written about our species, not after everything we have sacrificed to get here. It took several more years of careful preparation before the Council finally agreed on a path forward, years spent quietly expanding our scout operations, mapping the nearest sections of Concord space, gathering intelligence, and most importantly, finishing construction on something that had existed only as blueprints and half-built prototypes for decades. A true fleet, built entirely by human hands, using human ingenuity, shaped by 2 centuries of hard-earned lessons that no outside teacher had ever guided us through. I was there, standing on a viewing platform overlooking the massive orbital shipyards above Earth, the night the final vessel in that first fleet was completed. It was named the Horizon Ascendant, a name chosen by public vote from across every human colony, and as its running lights flickered on for the first time against the dark backdrop of space, I felt something shift inside my chest that I had been waiting over a century to feel. We were no longer simply survivors, huddled behind a barrier built by strangers who had judged us unworthy. We had become something entirely new, forged in isolation, tempered by hardship, and shaped by 200 years of refusing to accept that exile was the end of our story. Standing there that night, watching the fleet gather in formation for the first time, I thought back to the words my father had spoken to me on the evening the veil first closed. words I had carried with me through every dark year that followed. Now we get to find out who we actually are. I finally understood, fully and completely, exactly what he had meant, and I understood, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that the galaxy beyond that shimmering barrier had absolutely no idea what was about to come through it. The fleet crossed the seam in the veil exactly at dawn, Earth time, though of course there was no true sunrise waiting for us on the other side, only the endless dark of open space and the faint, ancient light of stars that had not looked upon a human face in over 200 years. I stood on the bridge of the Horizon Ascendant beside Ruth Hale, now an admiral, her hair gray but her eyes as sharp and focused as they had been the night the first small scout ship made its crossing decades earlier. Around us, arranged in careful formation, moved 42 vessels, representing the full strength of everything humanity had built during our long isolation. Warships and support craft and diplomatic vessels traveling together, a fleet built not for conquest, but for something far more deliberate. "Sensors are picking up activity," a young officer reported from her station, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "Multiple Concord vessels converging on our position. They have noticed us, Admiral." Ruth did not flinch. "Good," she said quietly. "We did not come here to sneak past them." Word had spread quickly through Concord space in the hours following our crossing, exactly as we had planned. We had not attempted to hide our presence or slip quietly toward some hidden destination. Instead, our fleet broadcast a clear, calm signal on every frequency our scouts had identified during their years of careful observation, a message crafted with enormous care by Earth's diplomatic council, stating simply that humanity had returned to the region of space beyond the veil, and requested a meeting with representatives of the Concord Tribunal. The first ships to intercept us belonged to a Concord border patrol, small and clearly outdated compared to our own vessels, their captains broadcasting frantic, confused demands for us to halt and explain our presence. Ruth allowed our fleet to slow, not stop, simply slow, a deliberate show that we were willing to communicate but not willing to be commanded. "This is Admiral Ruth Hale of the Unified Human Fleet," she said, her voice broadcast clearly across every channel the patrol ships were using. "We are not here to threaten your border. We are here to speak with the tribunal that placed our species under the Veil Protocol 206 years ago. We would prefer this to be handled peacefully. That choice, however, belongs to you." There was a long pause before the patrol commander responded, his voice tight with something between disbelief and fear. "That is not possible," he said. "No vessel has crossed the veil in 2 centuries. Your technology should not exist." I remember the small, grim smile that crossed Ruth's face as she answered him. "That is precisely the point we are here to make." Over the following days, as word of humanity's return spread across Concord space faster than any official announcement could contain it, our fleet made its slow, deliberate way toward the nearest major tribunal outpost, escorted by an increasingly large and nervous collection of Concord vessels that seemed unsure whether they were guarding us or being watched by us in return. I spent much of that journey reviewing reports from our intelligence teams, who had spent years quietly gathering information about how the wider galaxy had changed, or rather, how little it had changed, during our long absence. The Concord, it turned out, remained the dominant political body across this region of the galaxy, but its structure had grown rigid, its member species comfortable in positions of power they had held for centuries without serious challenge. Several smaller species, ones who had never held much influence within the tribunal system, had grown quietly resentful of Concord policies that favored older, more established worlds. It was among these smaller species that our diplomatic teams found the first signs of something we had not expected: genuine sympathy, even quiet admiration for what humanity had apparently accomplished during our exile. A representative from a small trading species called the Ilven reached out to our fleet during the journey, requesting a private communication that Ruth allowed me to help conduct, given my long history with the original tribunal proceedings. "We remember your case," the Ilven representative told us, her voice careful but genuine. "Many of us believed the punishment was too severe, decided too quickly, out of fear rather than justice. We were not powerful enough to argue against it at the time. Perhaps things have changed." It was a small conversation, but it planted something important in my mind. A realization that the galaxy we were returning to was not a single unified force standing against us, but a complicated web of different species, different interests, and different opinions about what had been done to us 2 centuries earlier. The tribunal outpost itself, when we finally arrived, was larger and more heavily defended than the small monitoring stations our scout ships had encountered near the Veil, but even here, I could see the signs of a civilization that had grown comfortable rather than continuing to advance. Their defensive technology, while respectable, showed clear signs of design philosophies that had not meaningfully changed in generations. Nora Fenwick, watching the same sensor readings from her position aboard one of our support vessels, sent a message to Ruth that I happened to see during that tense approach. "Their armor plating uses the same base composition from 200 years ago," she wrote. "Small refinements only. We passed this level of technology decades ago and kept going." I do not think anyone aboard our fleet felt anything like arrogance reading those words. If anything, it deepened the strange, quiet sorrow that many of us carried during that approach, the understanding that our exile, our suffering, our 2 centuries of hardship, had happened at the hands of a civilization that had simply stopped pushing itself the moment it removed the one variable it found unpredictable. The meeting itself took place in a chamber not unlike the one I had stood in as a young man, though this one had been hastily prepared, clearly not designed to host a delegation of this size on short notice. I found myself standing once again before a panel of tribunal judges, though not a single face among them was one I recognized from that first terrible day. 2 centuries had passed for them as well, even if their alien lifespans meant the passage felt different than it did for the handful of us who remembered the original verdict firsthand. Ruth Hale stood at the center of our delegation, though she had insisted, quietly and firmly, that I stand beside her, given that I was among the very few humans present who had witnessed both the beginning and, we hoped, the resolution of our exile. The lead judge, a younger member of the same stone-skinned species as the one who had sentenced us so long ago, studied our delegation with an expression I found difficult to read. "You return after 206 years, he said, "with a fleet, unannounced, uninvited, demanding an audience. Many among the tribunal see this as confirmation of everything we originally feared about your species." Ruth's response was calm, measured, and utterly without apology. "We return after 206 years of surviving a punishment handed down without a defined end, without a path to release, and without any consideration for what such isolation might create in a species left entirely to its own resources. We did not come here uninvited. We came here because your own laws stated that we would remain exiled until the tribunal determined we had become safe. Since no representative of this body ever returned to make that determination, we have made it necessary to determine it together." There was a long, tense silence throughout the chamber. I watched the judges exchange glances, some clearly uncertain, others visibly resistant to the entire idea that a species they had dismissed as dangerous and primitive could speak to them with this kind of composed authority. "Your fleet alone," another judge finally said, an older being with pale, translucent skin, "demonstrates a level of military capability that concerns this tribunal deeply. How are we meant to trust a species that arrives armed rather than empty-handed?" This time I stepped forward, feeling the weight of over 2 centuries of memory settle into my voice as I spoke. "Because we learned, the hard way, exactly what happens to a species that arrives without the ability to protect itself," I said. "We were judged unsafe based on a single tragic misunderstanding, given no path toward correction, and sealed away for 200 years with no promise that anyone would ever check on us again. We built what we built because we had no other choice. We did not build it to threaten this tribunal. We built it because we refused to ever again stand in a chamber like this one, powerless, waiting for strangers to decide our fate." The debate that followed stretched across several long, difficult days, filled with arguments both for and against humanity's continued exile, filled with old fears resurfacing alongside newer, quieter voices arguing that a species capable of what we had accomplished deserved, at the very least, the chance to be heard as equals rather than prisoners. It was during those tense days that the true depth of our transformation became clear, not through any dramatic display of force, but through simple, patient demonstration. Our diplomatic teams shared carefully selected records of our history during the Veil years, not to boast, but to explain, showing the tribunal the schools, the hospitals, the unified government, the culture of relentless self-improvement that had grown from isolation rather than despair. We showed them Grace Ellison's early reactor designs, Nora Fenwick's advanced armor plating, Claire Dunmore's small mountain school that had never once closed its doors despite decades of hardship. Slowly, carefully, the tone within the tribunal chamber began to shift, not because every judge suddenly trusted us completely, but because the evidence before them made it impossible to continue pretending we were the same frightened, uncertain species they had exiled 2 centuries earlier. On the final day of that long negotiation, the lead judge, the younger stone-skinned representative who had first addressed us, looked out across our delegation with an expression that finally seemed closer to respect than fear. "The tribunal acknowledges," he said slowly, that the punishment placed upon your species was severe, poorly defined, and left without appropriate oversight. We acknowledge that your survival and your growth during that period was achieved entirely through your own efforts, without guidance or support from this body. He paused, glancing at his fellow judges before continuing. The question before us now is not whether your exile should end. That much has become clear. The true question, Daniel Cole, Admiral Hale, is what role your species intends to play in this galaxy going forward, now that you have returned as something far different from the frightened, uncertain people we once turned away. Ruth Hale looked at me for a brief moment, and I understood, without a single word passing between us, that we had reached the moment we had spent decades preparing for. The moment when humanity would finally answer that question for itself, on our own terms, for the very first time. Ruth Hale did not answer the tribunal immediately. She let the silence stretch long enough that every judge in that chamber understood we were not going to be rushed into a decision the way we once had been, 2 centuries earlier, when a frightened young man named Daniel Cole stood alone in a similar chamber with no fleet behind him, and no history to point to except a single tragic afternoon. Humanity does not seek membership within the Concord as it currently stands, Ruth finally said, and I watched several judges shift uncomfortably at the directness of her words. We do not ask to be readmitted as a smaller junior species grateful for permission to rejoin a system that abandoned us without explanation or oversight for 200 years. We are prepared instead to establish formal relations with the Concord as an independent, sovereign power, on equal standing, with our own territory, our own laws, and our own fleet, exactly as any other established civilization within this galaxy currently maintains. The reaction inside that chamber was immediate and varied. Several older judges reacted with visible alarm, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of a species they had once dismissed as primitive now demanding equal standing rather than humble gratitude. Others, particularly the younger judges and several observing delegates from smaller species like the Ilvan representative I had spoken with earlier, seemed almost relieved, as though they had been waiting for someone to finally speak this plainly within these walls. This is an extraordinary demand, the pale, translucent judge said, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. You ask this tribunal to treat your species as an equal power after a single fleet crossed our border unannounced. Equal standing is earned through generations of demonstrated cooperation, not claimed through a single bold act of defiance. I stepped forward then, feeling the same weight I had felt in that first chamber so long ago, though this time it settled differently across my shoulders, less like a burden and more like something I had finally grown strong enough to carry. With great respect, I said, equal standing was never offered to us as something to be earned gradually and fairly. It was denied entirely, the moment a single misunderstanding occurred during our very first years of contact with this galaxy. You did not give us the opportunity to demonstrate growth over generations. You removed that opportunity from us completely, and left us to build an entire civilization in isolation instead. We have done exactly that. What you are looking at today is not a single bold act of defiance. It is 200 years of demonstrated cooperation, discipline, and growth, achieved entirely among ourselves, because you left us no other option. The chamber fell silent again, and this time the silence carried a different weight, something closer to reluctant acknowledgement than open resistance. It took 3 more days of careful negotiation before the tribunal reached its final decision, 3 days during which I watched Ruth Hale, Nora Fenwick, and dozens of other human representatives handle every difficult question, every remaining doubt, with a patience and clarity that would have seemed impossible to the frightened, struggling people we had been during those first hard decades behind the veil. We were not asking to be forgiven. We were presenting ourselves plainly, as we had actually become, and allowing the tribunal to decide whether it was ready to accept that reality. On the final day, the lead judge addressed our full delegation one last time, his voice carrying a formality that suggested he understood exactly how significant this moment truly was, not only for humanity, but for the future structure of the entire Concord itself. After extensive deliberation, he said, this tribunal formally acknowledges the sovereignty of the human collective, effective immediately. The Veil Protocol is permanently rescinded. Human territory, including your home system and all established colonies, is recognized as independent, self-governed space, protected under the same treaties and mutual defense agreements, extended to any established Concord power. Furthermore, given the demonstrated technological and organizational capabilities presented during these proceedings, the tribunal extends a formal invitation for the human collective to participate in future Concord Council sessions, not as a petitioning species, but as an invited equal. I do not think I truly believed it, not fully, until Ruth turned to me afterward, her composed expression finally breaking into something close to disbelief and quiet joy. "We did it, Daniel," she said softly. "After everything, we actually did it." News of the tribunal's decision spread across Concord space within days, and the reaction, as I had expected from our intelligence reports, was far from unanimous. Several older, more established species reacted with open concern, uncomfortable with the sudden emergence of a sovereign power whose full capabilities remained largely unknown to them. Others, particularly smaller species who had long felt overlooked within the Concord's rigid hierarchy, reached out to our delegation almost immediately, eager to establish trade relationships and diplomatic ties with a civilization that had proven, undeniably, what determination and unity could accomplish, even under the harshest circumstances. The Ilvan representative who had first reached out during our journey to the tribunal outpost became one of humanity's earliest and most enthusiastic allies, her people quickly establishing trade agreements that benefited both our civilizations enormously. Within the first year alone, similar agreements followed with a dozen other smaller species, all of them drawn to humanity not out of fear, but out of genuine respect for what we represented. Proof that a civilization did not need centuries of gradual, cautious growth under someone else's guidance to become powerful, wise, and worthy of equal standing. I returned to Earth roughly 18 months after that final tribunal decision, older now by every measure except the strange, extended years our medical advances had granted me, and I remember standing once again on that same observation deck where Grace Ellison and I had watched the veil first begin to close, so many decades earlier. The sky above Earth looked different now, filled not with the faint silver scar of an alien barrier, but with the steady, confident movement of human vessels traveling openly between our system and the wider galaxy beyond, a sight that would have seemed impossible to the frightened young man I had once been. Grace herself, remarkably still alive thanks to the very medical advances her early research had helped make possible, joined me on that deck during my visit, her hair fully white now, her hands still marked by decades-old burns she had never bothered to hide. "Do you remember what you said to me?" she asked, "the night the veil started closing?" I did remember, clearly, every word of it. "I said we had better learn to live without them," I answered. She smiled, looking out at the ships moving steadily across the dark sky above us. "You were right," she said. "We did learn to live without them. And in doing that, we became something they never expected, something far stronger than the species they were so afraid of in the first place." I think often about that conversation now, many years later, as I sit here recording these memories for whoever might wish to understand exactly how humanity's exile truly ended. We were not rescued. We were not forgiven out of pity or sudden change of heart among our former judges. We simply grew, patiently and relentlessly, until the very civilization that once cast us aside had no choice but to recognize what we had become. Today, humanity holds a respected, influential position within the wider Concord Council. Our territory expanded far beyond the boundaries of our original solar system, our fleet respected as one of the most capable and disciplined forces in this entire region of the galaxy. Younger species now study our history, not as a cautionary tale about unpredictable violence, but as an example of resilience, unity, and the astonishing potential that exists within a civilization determined to prove itself worthy on its own terms, rather than waiting patiently for permission that might never come. I am an old man now, older than any human being was ever meant to live, and I have spent these final years traveling between the worlds our people fought so hard to reach, meeting the descendants of those first frightened colonists who once huddled together behind a barrier they never chose, watching them stand now as equals among species who once considered us little more than a dangerous mistake. They wanted us gone, all those centuries ago. They wanted a species too fast, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be trusted, sealed away quietly where it could no longer threaten the comfortable order they had built for themselves. 200 years later, they welcomed us instead as something they never expected, not a plague to be feared, not a threat to be contained, but a kingdom, standing proudly on its own foundation, whether the rest of the galaxy had truly wanted that outcome or not. And as I look out now, across the vast, open stars that once felt so completely beyond our reach, I finally understand, fully and completely, exactly what my father meant to me on that first cold night so long ago, when everything we knew seemed lost, and everything we would eventually become was still waiting quietly, patiently, for its chance to finally begin.